Well, thank you very much for being here this morning. Mary Ann, thanks for the introduction. I just wanted to mention that the City Beautiful Commission, they do an outstanding job every year, and really they're instrumental in keeping Centerville the beautiful place it is. So for the City Beautiful Commission and all the members and those who have served in the past, we really appreciate all that you've done for the city. So thank you very much. And just if I could, I wanted to mention just a couple people that are here today. Drew Simon, who works with the city, community resource coordinator for the city of Centerville. David Swanson, back there in the back, who's from Public Works Department. He's one of our engineers. He had one of the booths out there. And have with us also this morning the chair of our Board of Architecture Review. Ed Ross is right here up front and been very instrumental in great preservation of our community assets and working very much with the Uptown Plan. Belinda Kenley, who's a Centerville council member right up here, and also our Deputy Mayor, Joanne Rao, who's right up front here. And Joanne is the liaison with the City Beautiful Commission, has done a great job there. So thank you all for being here. So with that said, I'm going to head into our speaker today. And we are very fortunate to have with us, she is a repeat speaker, Pam Coral Bennett, and she is a graduate of The Ohio State University. She is also an international speaker. She's had an opportunity to deliver speeches in Turkey, Greece, and also in China. So very fortunate to have her here again this year. She is also an author. If you have a chance to go to Amazon, she has a book. It's called Gardenpedia, all the gardening terms and information you'll need from A to Z. And as a matter of fact, it has 56 reviews, 88% of which are 5-star reviews. So it's a very well-received book, and for Amazon to have that many comments, that's really something. And to have that many positive comments, you get 88% of anything, you're doing something very good. So Pam also serves as a weekly columnist for the Dayton Daily News, Cox Media Papers around here. She's a park commissioner in Clark County. She's an associate professor at the Ohio State University, and she's been doing that for about 40 years now. You've been in the business for about 40 years. And most importantly, she enjoyed being here last year, so she's coming back again this year. So Pam, thank you very much for being here. We're honored that you came back again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mayor. I appreciate it. And I paid 56 friends to make comments. So that's how you get comments on Amazon, right? And Mary Ann, thank you for having me here again this year. I appreciate it. I love doing this kind of talk, and I love this particular talk. I will warn you, it might be a little controversial. There are some things I'm going to share with you that you may believe one way or the other, and that's perfectly fine. Everybody has their own gardening philosophy, and that's what is most important, though. You do what you like. But what we're going to talk about today, it doesn't have to be all or nothing. Incorporating pollinators into your landscape. How many of you feel guilty for not having an all-native landscape? Anybody? I mean, seriously, if you look at social media, thou shalt have all-native plants, right? To take care of our pollinators. So, and that's good. Don't get me wrong. We want to take care of our pollinators. But we don't have to feel guilty if we don't have all native plants. And I'm going to share with you today some ways, first the importance of pollinators, how to attract those pollinators, and then some of those plants that may not be native but are also really good plants to incorporate into the landscape, and then native plants that you can use in the landscape that look good. Okay? So let's get started. According to the Audubon Society, restoring native plant habitat is vital to preserving biodiversity. I want you to pay attention to this sentence right here. By creating a native plant garden, each patch of habitat. That's what we're going to kind of talk about today, is that patch of habitat. We'll get a little more into that in depth. So closing your eyes, your mental image of a native plant garden is what? What do you see? Native plant garden. A prairie, a meadow. What do you see? What does it look like? Coneflower, okay. What does it look like? What is the appearance of it? Beautiful. Oh, weed patch? Wild. Out of control. Thank you for being honest, because that is exactly what many people think it looks like. You think it looks beautiful, and it does. It's in the eye of the beholder. Several years ago, I judged for Communities in Bloom, did 24 cities in Canada, and we went to a corporate park. And this was probably back in the early 2000s. And this corporate park was addressing the whole issue of pollinators at that time, and they had a native plant garden at the entrance to the corporate park. And they got so many complaints. Why don't you mow that? Why are you letting that go to weeds? Why does this look so bad? Nobody liked it. We still have that perspective today, right? People still don't always see the value and why. Because a native plant garden can look weedy, can look messy. So we have to change our perspectives, for one thing, but we also can incorporate many of our native plants into the landscape and still look good. Is this native plants? Yes. Native? Yes. Native? 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 That's a native pond. Native? Native? So native plant gardens come in all different kinds of appearances. And native plants occur naturally in their ecoregion and habitat, and they've adapted over time, so they've been around for a long time. Now, one thing I will tell you, many will say native plants have root systems that really dig through and break up clay soils. They don't. Native plants planted on our heavy clay soils don't do that job. Native plants on native soils have deep root systems. That is indeed true. But native plants are not going to break up our clay soils because our clay soils, compacted clay soils, aren't native. So when you see, put native plants in because they'll break up your clay soil, that is not necessarily going to happen. Do you like tomatoes and peppers? Yeah? If you like tomatoes and peppers, you can't have them if you're a purist in terms of native plants, right? So we don't have to be purists, but we sure do want to start incorporating some of these plants in because they are beneficial to our pollinators, but I also contend that other plants are as beneficial as well. So it doesn't have to be all or nothing. And I've been doing this talk quite frequently, and one of the biggest comments that I get from people is, thank you for letting me know that I'm okay by putting introduced plants into the landscape, those coneflowers varieties that I like. It's thank you for making me feel like I'm not a bad person for not having an all-native plant garden, okay? So let's talk a little bit about pollinators. There are a lot of different pollinators. Most people tend to think of bees as the only pollinator, but we've got butterflies, we've got animals, and of course we know what pollinators do. They're fertilizing plants, they're keeping the species going. Plants have evolved so that they attract pollinators, because if they didn't have pollinators, they may not continue with that species. And then pollinators are definitely necessary for 3/4 of our food crops. So it's really important that we do pay attention, that we do care, and we do try to take care of our pollinators. So who are these pollinators? Honeybees is the most prevalent. When it comes to pollinators, they're the number one, top of the list. Most of them are honeybees. But is our honeybee native? No, it's imported. So even though we want native plants, we also have those native insects to deal with, or non-native. There are other bee species. Over 500 native bee species in Ohio. So these are the ones that most people don't know about or don't think about. And these are the ones that we want to really start thinking about, because those are the ones that are attracted to many of our plants. So bumblebees. Bumblebees are social bees. They're the ones, out there just flying around. They won't usually sting unless you, get in their way or they get up your shorts or something, but they won't be a problem. Solitary ground nesting are the mining bees. Okay, they're the ones that come in, mine through. They can be a problem. They will get in the ground. They will get in mulch piles, so you kind of got to be careful about that. And mason bees and leaf cutting bees, I'm going to talk a little bit more about these a little bit later on. They're solitary and they're cavity nesting. So we'll talk a little bit more about those. Butterflies, moths. Now wasps, sometimes they're considered pollinators, but they actually feed their young insects, so spiders and other things like that. So they're not using pollen to feed their young, but they go for the nectar. They like the nectar. And then beetles, ground beetles, flies, birds, some birds, and then bats. These are all considered pollinators. And of course, the one thing missing up there that's an important pollinator is the wind. Many things are wind pollinated. Tomatoes are wind pollinated. So there's a lot of different pollinators out there. So here are some of the problems. And I contend, and this is purely based on my observations, it's all anecdotal, it is not research-based, that habitat loss is one of the big things in terms of our pollinator decrease. Think of a housing area. I don't know if there are any down here in this area. My son lives up in Beaver Creek, in Hunter's Ridge, I think it is. You go into that housing area, and what plants do we see? We see grass, turf grass. We see concrete, not a plant, but we see a lot of concrete.
Bushes.
What kind of bushes?
Taxes.
Some taxes, but more today we see boxwoods. Yep, the boxwoods are the primary bush shrub that we all use. We might see a Callery pear. Well, we do see lots of Callery pears. And by the way, Callery pears are illegal today. Yeah, illegal today. Unfortunately, there are some that would say, hey, can we have a program within the city of Centerville where we cut down a tree, a Callery pear, and you'll give us a free tree? Well, that's nice and that's a good gesture, but just drive up and down the highway. We're not gonna get rid of all the Callery pears. So they're here to stay. We're gonna deal with them. Still cut down that Callery pear and put something up nice that is good. Now, do Callery pears attract pollinators? Yeah, they do. They do, because pear trees are good for pollinators. So think about this Hunter's Ridge. I drive through there back to my son's house. They might have a hydrangea or two, because those are the hot plants to use today. So we have 4 species probably at the max. And if you aren't into flowers, you don't have flowers during the summer. So what do we have for pollinators? Very little. So in these housing districts, we're putting in the same plants because it's easy. We're not doing a lot of flowers. We're not encouraging people to plant. Even a container of annuals could be beneficial for a pollinator. So I contend that we need to work on this piece right here, creating that habitat that used to be there at one time. And it doesn't have to be all the goldenrod and all the weeds and native plants that were there. It can be a lot of new plants, but it has to be something. It has to be something. We also know that pesticides have caused problems. Agricultural pesticides or homeowner pesticides used improperly. Beekeepers have to use pesticides many times because they have problems in their beehives, so they're having to use pesticides to take care of varroa mites and some of the diseases they have. Then we had, with bees, we had colony collapse disorder, mites, viruses that I just mentioned, all these problems, and then we have climate change. So we've got several things working against the pollinators, but again, as I think about this, I really think that this is one of the biggest issues, and I challenge you to drive through neighborhoods and drive through the community and see where those flowers are or are not. So these are the basic needs of pollinators, and this is what you want to start looking at in terms of evaluating your landscape. Look at your landscape. Do you have food? Food's going to be the flowers, the nectar, and so forth. Do you have water? I just love when we get a rain shower and in my yard or my driveway, puddles start to form and the yellow sulfur butterflies just loaded. They love, playing in that water. So you do have a water source for your pollinators. Shelter, cover for nesting and overwintering, so trees and shrubs around the area. Travel corridors, that travel corridor is that patch to patch, that habitat patch, traveling from one place to another. Safety, we all need safety. Space in a suitable arrangement where you have masses of plants. So these are the things that your pollinators need. And again, the QR code at the beginning has all of this on there. They will be posting it to the Centerville website, correct? In terms of being able to get this handout, so you'll have all this information at your fingertips. So go through and just check your landscape. Just do an evaluation. Evaluate your garden like a pollinator. So we're going to go through some things that pollinators look for and that actually attract pollinators. Flowers with attractive color, patterns, and aromas. Definitely the aromas, we know that. Aromas have evolved because they do attract the pollinators. But the color patterns, and typically your blues, yellow, purple, violets, whites, those are the colors that the majority of the pollinators are going to look for. So look for those colors. Pollen that's easily released from the anther. Think about an Asiatic lily or an Easter lily that you got. As soon as you brush up against that, That pollen just destroys your clothes because it almost stains them. That is easily released from the anther. How do you know that? Just go out and look. Go out and look at your plants. Look for the anthers. Look for the pollen on those anthers. It's easy to see through observation. Pollen with high protein content, we don't know many times with some of our plants if they have high protein content or not. This is one of the reasons why native plants are recommended, because we know that they are species rich and abundant with pollinators. So the native plants do have this high protein content. But what we don't know is, do our introduced plants have high protein content? That's where research is still ongoing. We need a lot more research in terms of pollinators. And then a nectar reward. Pollen and nectar is what they're looking for. One of the easiest things to do is aim for flowers or something in bloom 3 seasons of the year: spring, summer, and fall. Boy, if we could get it through the winter, that would be great. You know, there's those real warm sunny days when the pollinators come out, but many of them don't come out unless it's really extremely warm, and then they're hunting for something and can't find it. Beekeepers take care of that by giving them marshmallow fluff, marshmallow cream, do other kind of concoctions like that so they have a little bit of sugar if we do get a 60, 70 degree day in January. But you can do this by going to spring, summer, and fall. Evaluate your landscape right now. What is in bloom right now in your landscape? Tulips, daffodils, crocus. Are lilacs blooming already down here? Okay, lilacs, not quite in Springfield yet. Hyacinths, hellebores, trees. Yeah, so it's not just the flowers. We have a tendency, because we're gardeners, we really think about the flowers. Lots of flowers we can put in. But what about those trees? About 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, maples were blooming. Red maples, right here. Excellent for pollinators. They're wind pollinated, but the pollinators like them as well. Back in February, we had witch hazel. Flies on that thing like crazy. And again, not just bees, but flies are also pollinators. Pretty soon, probably in about another 3 days, we're going to have boxwood blooming in Springfield area. Buttonbush in August. September, August, September, going into the fall with your sedum, your asters, and so forth. So looking at your landscape, look at the plants that you have, what do you have in bloom, and not just flowers, annuals and perennials, but what other things are in bloom that pollinators could use. And then 3 seasons, 3 species. So don't get stuck on just having something in the spring, summer, and fall. Look at 3 different species. And this is 9 different species that a home in Hunter's Ridge would put in to help attract those pollinators with that pollinator habit. So spring, again, witch hazel. Fall, summer truly is kind of a no-brainer for pollinators, right? I mean, we are all gardeners. We have tons of plants that are in color for pollinators in the summer, so we don't have to worry as much about that. But it's spring and fall. And since I put this talk together and started doing this talk, I'm out looking at my landscape each month to see what I have available. And I'm not looking at just spring, I'm looking at February, March, April, May, June 22nd, right? So I'm looking at the entire part of the spring, early spring, mid-spring, and late spring, and not just that, okay, let's just put a magnolia in and it's blooming right now and it looks great. So look at that season long, or that spring, all spring long, as opposed to just early spring. So provide that season color for nectar and pollinators. Use masses. Pollinators can see visually masses of flowers much easier than they can one. So instead of putting 1 cone flower in, put 3 or 4 and put them together. So you have the masses of flowers that will attract them much easier than just 1 flower. Put these species all together then. So in a small area, you have coneflower, daisies, you have all different species here together that can be used to attract pollinators. We are doing right now with Denise Ellsworth, who is our bee specialist up at Worcester, we're getting ready to plant a paint-by-number pollinator garden. And I'll give you some resources where you can find the information on this. We had a landscape designer design a really nice pollinator garden for a 10 by 10 area. Now 10 by 10 is probably about here down to her. So this area right here is all you would need in your landscape to have a pollinator habitat. So we're trying to encourage people to start small and then hopefully spread out to all the 3 seasons, 3 species, and so forth. When you're doing this, include a diversity of flower shapes. You know, hummingbirds like the tubular flowers. Your butterflies like the flat top flowers, such as this. So look at all the different shapes that you might find in flowers and flower shapes. Now, this is an exaggeration of using color to connect a habitat. So you can see all the tulips. This is down at the Cincinnati Zoo and Botanic Garden, which right now, if you can get there tomorrow or the next day, the peak tulip season down there is just absolutely phenomenal. But this is connecting all those habitats. So if one person planted a 10 by 10 pollinator garden in Hunter Ridge, well, that would support some. But if we all started connecting those, then we have much more opportunity for pollinator numbers to increase. Connecting habitat, all the different plants that go clear through this area for pollinators. Catmint is an excellent pollinator plant. Excellent to attract pollinators, but in this area, you've got just catmint. You don't have anything else to connect it. So the idea is to try to figure out how we can get other neighbors to connect and put in some plants to attract those pollinators. Small bees fly less than up to about 100 feet. Bumblebees maybe up to a mile. So in thinking of this, looking at your neighborhood, looking at all the plants you might have around, you've got to have those habitat connections. And that's why I feel it's really important that that's more at the top of the list in terms of pollinator decline than anything. Floral abundance and diversity. So not just all coneflower, put in several different, because certain pollinators like certain plants. And they like to visit those plants repeatedly. They go back and forth. They make small, short trips, go back, small, short trips, go back and feed their young and so forth. So they're not going to fly big distances and be searching for a lot of different things. So when you have that diversity for pollinators, then you're going to get more species rich in numbers of pollinators. All right, here's the big question. Here's where everybody kind of is either pro or anti-incorporated plants. So what is a cultivar? A cultivar is a cultivated variety, okay? It is something that somebody discovered maybe out in nature, or maybe it was something that was intentionally crossed, and as a result, you came out with this plant that had incredible characteristics. And you made that a cultivar by asexually propagating that. Sexual propagation, you're going to get any variety of things, but by taking cuttings and rooting those cuttings, or however you're doing it asexually, you'll get that same plant with that same genetic forever. Unless it's a variegated cultivar, because sometimes variegated plants, the farther down the gene pool, you keep propagating, sometimes those variegated plants revert back to their parent. And if you've ever had a variegated sedum, I've seen this with sedum, I've seen this with other variegated plants where they've been propagated so many times that that gene pool is really thin and they revert back to just plain green. Or, how many of you have dwarf Alberta spruces? Does anybody have a dwarf Alberta spruce? You know, real short, compact. Have you ever seen them all of a sudden shoot up and look like a regular spruce? That is where that dwarf Alberta spruce was discovered, was asexually propagated, and then every time they just keep propagating more and more, that gene pool gets diluted, and all of a sudden it reverts back to its parent. Okay, so those are cultivars. Can cultivars be of native plants? Absolutely, absolutely. One of my good friends and great nurseryman up in the Lake County area, Klein Nurseries, Bill Hendricks. Last year we did a tour of his nursery, and he had collected buckeyes from all over Ohio, the buckeye seeds. Are buckeyes native? Yes, find them in the woodlands all over. Yep, they're native. So he collects all these buckeyes and he plants them out. He is looking for a buckeye that is resistant to Guignardia leaf blotch. How many of you have a buckeye in your landscape? Does it look really good in August?
No.
Not usually. Buckeyes look better in Michigan and Kentucky than they do in Ohio, unfortunately. So he's looking for one that is resistant to that disease. So he plants 100 buckeye seeds, and one comes up, and over the years, it's resistant. All the others get Gignardia, and this one doesn't. So genetically, it's still an Ohio buckeye. It's still genetically an Ohio buckeye, but it also has the potential to be a good product on the market because it doesn't get the disease. It's still a native plant. Now, with that, again, like I said, you keep propagating. Eventually, it may not be as attractive to pollinators. And a good example are daffodils. And I'll talk a little bit about that towards the end. A good example are daffodils. So we do know that locally native plants are species rich and are abundant. We have abundant pollinators on them. So species rich means they attract a lot of different pollinators, and abundant means there's a lot of numbers of all of those different pollinators. So what we're doing right now, and this is why it's such a challenge, we're trying to show some of those folks on social media that truly believe that you can only do native plants, that there are some other plants that also do just as well in attracting pollinators as our native plants. So it's not about, and I think people are concerned about that because, oh my gosh, I have to have a native plant garden to support pollinators. No, you don't. You can have a garden that looks beautiful and still support pollinators. So we are doing a couple of research projects. One is perennials for pollinators and one is annual for pollinators. And the annual for pollinators, Dr. Mary Gardner up in Worcester is leading this one because she thinks that if we could just get people in urban areas to plant container gardens or put a few extra flowers in their front landscape, we might be able to increase pollinator numbers. So with perennials for pollinators, and this came out of the Cincinnati Zoo last year, we put together a research project for 13 counties in Ohio, so it's replicated. We have 10 different cultivars of native plants. So we're using cultivars of native plants. Rudbeckia goldsturm, Perovskia specific cultivars, so we're using cultivars of native plants. Our volunteers are going out in the summer, and well, starting in mid-May through November, and counting the number of pollinators that are coming to those plants. Now, we're not counting down to the species like bees. We don't know. I don't even know native bee species. I can't identify them. But I know if it's a bee or a fly. So we're looking at bees. We are counting out the bumblebees and the mason bees because those are pretty easy to distinguish. Moths, butterflies, flies, ants, anything that we see on there, we are marking that into a survey, data collection survey. And then Ellen Danford, who's a grad student for Mary, is doing the magic behind the scenes and looking at the numbers and if there's statistical differences. Last year was our pilot year, and though our data is a little bit skewed because in this case we've got 8 eyes looking at this plant. In other counties we had 2 eyes looking at the plant, so 2 eyes aren't going to get as many pollinators as 8 eyes. So we're kind of narrowing down the qualifications and the criteria, and we're kind of smoothing everything out from last year. That was our pilot year. This year is going to be a true evaluation. So we're going to do this for 3 years. So it's replicated, it's repeated, and we have 13 counties that are doing this. So they're doing the data fill-in and so forth. And some preliminary data from last year, even though it wasn't the best data, showed that there were several of these that were abundant with species and had many different species on it. So it's a good thing that we're seeing this and we're going to do this because we want to show people that yes, cultivars can be just as useful in your landscape. We're also doing the annuals. So we have research plots in Columbus at Chadwick Arboretum, Springfield at Snyder Park Gardens and Arboretum, and down at the Cincinnati Zoo. And Mary's grad students are going to go monthly this summer and look at the same plants. I mean, again, we're picking like 10 different cultivars of annuals and looking at them over the course of the season. And they're observing and they're counting, and we're going to show that annuals also can be very beneficial for pollinators. In our trial gardens, this is on Columbus campus, Chadwick Arboretum, this salvia in front is Unplugged So Blue. And then there was another one called Unplugged So Pink. 2 different, same series, but 2 different colors. Unplugged So Blue had bumblebees, mason bees, honeybees, flies, native bees, was just loaded with a variety of species. Unplugged So Pink just had mason bees. That's the only thing that it attracted. So that's just observation, folks, and that's things that you can do in your landscape as well. Stand there between the hours of 10 and 12, not all 4 hours, but at some point in time, for just 2 minutes. Just 2 minutes. Look at that plant and observe. See what you're looking at. And there are some resources I'm going to share with you at the end that actually has Ohio native bees and how to identify. So you can really get down deep in this if you want to. If you don't want to, you can at least say, well, I know that's a fly, that's a bumblebee, that's a butterfly moth, etc. So you can at least get to that point of, in terms of the genus. So make those pollinator observations, and that's one of the things that I'm really encouraging people to do because it doesn't take much time. Enjoy your flowers, but while you're enjoying your flowers, look at them a little closer. Be very observant. This is zinnia, lantana. Zinnia, lantana, and salvia in terms of annuals are top of the list in attracting pollinators. Verbena is another one that attracts the pollinators. Lavandera angustifolia is another great one. Now, this one is part of the Suncredible Sunflower series. Did anybody plant Suncredible sunflowers last year? They're absolutely beautiful. So this is the Suncredible series. That is Suncredible, just the yellow. And this is Suncredible Saturn that has red stems and that nice dark kind of bronze inner color on the petals. Proven winner, Suncredible. Suncredible Saturn is the darker one. Sterile. Is that a good thing? No. Not for pollinators, but it might be. So this particular sunflower was bred because it doesn't have pollen and it doesn't shed pollen. Do any of you ever cut your sunflowers and bring them in the house and put them in a nice vase? What do you have the next morning on the dining room table? It's amazing how perfect that yellow ring is of the pollen. It's just amazing to me. So that sunflower does not have pollen, so it was bred for cut flower purposes. Not everybody likes that or appreciates that pollen ring on their table. So they bred this one. It was also bred because it is multi-branching. In other words, this right here, that is one plant. Yeah, multi-branching, so you get lots of stems and it just keeps on blooming. It doesn't give you that one flush of bloom like our sunflowers do and then shuts down, all right? So there's reasons that this was bred. We put this on Facebook and we got chastised by one lady that is totally a purist. You shouldn't plant anything that's sterile. Well, again, we all have our own philosophy. So another volunteer pointed this out. He says, well, it might be sterile, but look at it. It's yellow. It fits the attractiveness for pollinators, and it does. It attracts them in. And then when they come in and they're like, oh, there's nothing here. Well, looky here. We have other plants that will attract those pollinators. So don't hesitate to use something like this, but don't just plant all of this. Plant other things that can be helpful for pollinators. This is salvia black and blue. This is a mason bee. These big old bees have big butts and they can't fit down in that flower. So they actually rob the nectar. See that little tiny hole right there? They come in and they drill these little teeny tiny holes and they suck the nectar and they move on. Covered on this plant. Now honeybees can kind of get down in there, but the bumblebees can't. Doesn't damage the plant whatsoever. Doesn't damage the plant. I didn't learn about this until about 4 years ago. I didn't know that mason bees did that. And that's just, again, through that power of observation. Celosia is another good one. Celosia is very good for them. And then we have milkweed. And thank you to the young ladies with the Park District for giving us the milkweed to plant. But here's a hint. Don't put it in your vegetable garden. Don't put it in your flower bed unless you want just milkweed because it spreads. And I thought several years ago when pollinator problems first showed up, I thought, oh, I got milkweed popping up in my vegetable garden. I'll just let it go. Since then, I've been fighting it. But I do have it way in the back field, and I do have it in my quarter-acre prairie. So I have it on my property, but I'm not putting it in my vegetable garden. Do I feel guilty? No, absolutely not. Because I also want a vegetable garden. So I'm helping the pollinators in other ways, but I'm not going to let milkweed take over. But we do know that it is necessary for monarch butterflies. It's also necessary for those host plants. So think about when you are doing pollinators, especially butterflies, they also need host plants for their larvae, which means they need something to chew on. We'll talk about that in a little bit too. So, some native trees. There's a whole list of these trees, and right now blooming would be our cherries, prunus. In Springfield, our dogwoods are just getting started. You really got to love the smell of hawthorn if you're going to plant them. If you've ever had them or smelled them, they've got that almost calorie pear-like, stinky smell. Service berries in my house or my landscape are starting to bloom, and then summer oxydendron. So we have native trees that you can plant that are still really good in the landscape. Then we have shrubs. There's dogwoods, there's sambucus, elderberry, fothergilly. You don't see forsythia on here. Forsythia is one of those that's beautiful in the spring. We see it everywhere, but it's not necessarily a pollinator plant, but it's okay to have a forsythia or two. Just put something else in there. Viburnums, lots of great viburnums, lots of summer sweet clethra, spirea, willow. One of the things I've noticed over the years that I've been doing this in terms of breeding is that many of our new plants coming out are compact and a lot shorter, made for the urban landscape, made for the smaller backyard, front yard, and so forth, made for the hunter's ridge. Everybody lives on top of each other, next door. Made for those size of landscapes. They're perfect because there's a lot of really great shrubs coming out. Summer sweet clethra, I'll share a few of those with you, but they're nice and compact and they're great for pollinators. So let me go through a few of these plants here that are really good. We have the black chokeberry. This is a cultivar called Autumn Magic. Notice the flowers are in panicles. So it'll be blooming here. Probably I'd say in about another 3 weeks we'll start seeing it bloom. This is not a very good picture of it, but you can see the purplish fruits. Great fruits for birds in the fall, but excellent for pollinators in the spring. This is a short, compact, 3 foot tall, but it is a cultivar. Calycanthus, an excellent pollinator plus a larval source for our larvae. Blooms usually about late May. This is the species, and the species probably gets about, I would say, around 5 feet tall. But there are some new compact cultivars, and there are also some new ones that have really big flowers. And it has such great fragrance. Excellent for pollinators. The one downside about this, the upside is it really likes dry areas. I have it under black locust. The downside is that it sprouts profusely. So I'm constantly cutting all those sprouts that are invading other parts of my landscape, but it does sprout quite a bit. One of my favorite summer bloomers, buttonbush. Now, the species buttonbush blooms in August. It gets about 10 to 12 feet tall. It really likes moist areas. So if you have a moist area, it's going to be 10 to 12 feet tall, but it also likes dry areas. Well, it doesn't like dry areas. It survives in dry areas. I was looking at mine yesterday. I'm like, okay, are you going to come out? They're late to emerge. They came out last year. They don't get as big in a dry area. So if I'd water it, it would do a lot better. The one cultivar called Sugar Shack, a little bit shorter, a little bit more compact. So I urge you, if you need some shrubs, look at some of these new cultivars of shrubs and look at the list of our native shrubs and select some of these that are more suitable for a small landscape. Don't get forsythia that gets 15 feet tall and 12 feet wide and keep it like this. Look at those plants that you don't have to prune. You don't have to do anything to, you just let them go. And don't worry about the pruning and all the trouble that you have with it. One I really like is an August bloomer called Clethra, Summer Sweet Clethra. This is a cultivar called Ruby Spice with pink flowers. It's blooming in July and August. So it gives me that late season, late summer, early, I guess it would be kind of midsummer bloom. Summer Sweet Clethra, 3 foot tall, nice and compact. In my front of my house, very easy to grow. Witch hazel. Got to have a little bit of space for witch hazel. There are no compact witch hazels that I've seen yet, but this is one of the coolest plants when you want something in February, when there's not much else in color except brown and your dead brown grasses and so forth. This comes out in February and March with just beautiful strap-like flowers, which aren't really flowers. The flies were all over this plant on a really warm day in February. So it's a great pollinator for flies, plus it gives you just Awesome color. I will say there's different colors of the witch hazel. I have the one that's the dark orangey color. It's pretty, but if you have it somewhere out in the landscape, it blends into everything. This one's in the front of my house. It's way out in front from maybe here to the front door, and it just shines. I mean, it really shows up in the landscape. But the other darker red one I have close where I'm going to walk by it on a regular basis in the winter. We have native perennials. And these native perennials can easily be incorporated into your landscape. Lupines, asters, baptisia, mountain mint. Mountain mint, be careful. It's an incredible species rich, lots of them, but it will spread. It has a tendency to spread, but it is really good for pollinators. And liatris, partridge pea, cassia, all of these are outstanding native plants to incorporate into your landscape. And then we have some other ones. We did our wildflower walk yesterday in Clifton Gorge, and these are just now starting to bloom. American ginger, excellent ground cover in shade, very thick, very dense, crowds out everything else, and has these really cool dark reddish maroon blooms. What's it pollinated by? Ants and bees, if you tested yourself on the Parks District little quiz thing, which is really cool. Ants and bees pollinate this one. One of my favorites that I have in my landscape that is a spring ephemeral, and spring ephemeral means it comes up in the spring when it's cool, and when it's hot it just kind of dies out. It doesn't like the heat. Aqualegium canadensis, our wild columbine, spreads like crazy, which is a good thing. I don't care, because when it gets hot it's gone. I love it in the spring in my woodland area where it comes up and it just blooms like crazy, usually like late April. Beautiful plant for pollinators. Hummingbirds, if you're hummingbirds I see on social media, they're getting close. They should be coming around. Excellent plant for hummingbirds. Virginia bluebells, another one. All of these are native Ohio plants that I have incorporated into my woodland area. Now, I don't go out to Clifton Gorge and dig them. I buy them from the stores, and you should too. I mean, you've all heard that. Do not go to native plant areas or wildflower areas or anything like that. You don't dig them. You leave them there and go buy them. There's a lot of native plant nurseries. 15, 20 years ago, you would have been hard-pressed to find native plant nurseries to carry these, but there's a lot of them around Ohio. And I think Allwood also has anybody know about their plant sale? They have native plant sale? 28th of April? There you go. So if you want some of these native plants, you can get these. Columbine. So here's a good example. We have native columbines. Look at this flower and this flower. Which one would be more preferable to pollinators? The one on your right. Easier to get to the pollen, easier to get to the nectar. The one on the left is double flower. So many of our double and triple flowers are not going to be as beneficial. So there are some cone flowers that are really cool, pom-pom type flowers, but they're just not as easy to get to the pollen. So you want to look at that, not that you shouldn't have them. If you like them, you should keep them, but also look at some of the singles so that they'll attract them as well. This one is absolutely incredible. This whole genus, Allium, the onion family, yes. Allium are starting to bloom now, and there's varieties that you can get blooming in the fall, so you get them all summer long. This is a cultivar that came out about, 5, 6, 7 years ago, and it was a perennial plant of the year one year. But this thing is a robust plant. It doesn't flop. Don't fertilize it, just let it go. It doesn't flop. It stays nice and compact like this. It's about probably a foot tall, I'd say a little bit more than a foot, but watch this. Can you see the bees? Can you see the movement? Those are all honeybees. And this happened to be at one of our summer events. We have a garden jubilee the first Saturday in August. And I wasn't paying attention to this, had no idea, walked by it, and I was just stunned by the amount of honeybees. And there's a mason bee right there, that guy right there. Mason bees have shiny black butts. Bumblebees have fuzzy black butts. So that's how you tell the difference, okay? Again, just a plant that was outstanding for pollinators, and I didn't even pay attention to it until I saw it last year. Observation, knowing which ones they like. But a lot of our allium, the majority of our allium are very good. One word of caution, there are some allium that are really good for pollinators, but they also reseed prolifically. And allium drumstick is one of those. Had it in the garden. It's really cool. It looks like a little drumstick head. But when it reseeds, you get little tiny seedlings that make you think it's wild onions, but it's not, and they're just everywhere. They're just massive. And I'm digging them out constantly. So deadhead some of them, but this is one I would not deadhead because it looked good. Even last week when we cut it back, it still had that nice seed head on it. Asters for late fall. This is a cultivar called Almapotchki. Almapotchki is a little more compact, a little more rounded. Our New England asters are beautiful, but my New England asters go back in the prairie area where I don't care if they get tall and flop. But in my landscape, I don't want that floppy New England aster. So I've gotten cultivars, Almapotchki is one of them, that just look spectacular in late August and going into September. Baptisia is another one. Baptisia is a native plant. The one on the left is our native Baptisia. This is a cultivar called Hunt County, Texas. Just as many pollinators on it as I have on my native Baptisia. Turtlehead. Turtlehead you will find in woodland areas, not around here. I've never seen it in woodland areas around here. But turtlehead has these really cool flowers in August and September. Looks like a turtlehead, which is why it gets its common name. And this is a cultivar called Hot Lips. Nice pink hot color. Gets about 2 to 3 feet tall, 2 to 3 foot spread. Another late summer pollinator plant. And now here's an example of what I'm talking about. These just don't do as well in attracting pollinators as your flat top. This is a cultivar called Cheyenne Spirit. If you have coneflowers, just observe them this year. A lot of different pollinators will be coming to these. Joe Pye weed, and it used to be Eupatorium, now I think it's Eucotrochium, different genus. Our taxonomists like to change the names all the time. And this is a short, compact one. You know, if you look at Joe Pye weed out in the native areas, how tall does it get? 5, 6 foot tall, and it usually falls over if it's not supported by other plants. This is one called Gateway, 3 foot tall. Nice compact plant for the landscape. Monardas. The two, Fistulosa and Didyma, are both native. While Bergamo is Fistulosa, Scarlet Bee Balm is Didyma. There are several cultivars of these, from the 4 feet Jacob Klein on the right-hand side down to the 2 foot other cultivars that are out there on the market. They are fabulous for pollinators. They have that kind of a tubular shaped flower with lots of them, so they bring in a lot of the butterflies and the moths. Anybody grow passion flower? Anybody know that this is native to Ohio? It's actually native down around southern Ohio. You'll find it quite a bit down along the river area where they're a little warmer zone. But I have this growing in my landscape. This is a cultivar called Ammon's Blue. And I will tell you that the carpenter bees, the honeybees, and the bumblebees love this. And it starts blooming like around July, and it continues on blooming clear up until we get a good frost. And the really fun thing about it, the fruits, they never get to the point where you can actually eat them. I mean, you can't eat passion flower or passion fruits. They get to the point where they're great if you pick them, you put them on the ground, and you stomp on them. They're called maypops, and they make this great popping sound, so much to the point where my grandkids now know they go in there and start digging and find them, and they're all over the front sidewalk. They're really a lot of fun. One of my favorites, this one right here. Have I said one of my favorites before today? Because I have lots of favorites. Somebody asked me yesterday what my favorite plant was, and I can't tell you. I don't know. Rudbeckia maxima, giant brown-eyed Susan. The flowers are good for pollinators. You can't see them. They're like 9 feet tall. They really don't give you much of an impression for the flowers, but look at that foliage. Big, I mean, foot-size foliage that's nice and silver. Great for the back of the perennial garden or the back of the landscape. This is just, I mean, that is just stunning to put in there for the color of the foliage and knowing that up there somewhere there's pollinators enjoying those blooms that we can't see. Other Rudbeckias, Goldsturm, Henry Eilers, both very good for pollinators. Salvias, I mentioned. Just about any salvia. I don't know that I've ever seen a salvia, I'm sure there's one out there, that doesn't attract pollinators. These are your perennial salvia, May Night, East Friesland, your annual salvia. They're just outstanding for pollinators. And here's an example of May Night in bloom. This is carnations or dianthus pinks. Not so good for pollinators. Pretty, I'll have it in there. but not so good for pollinators. There's the Baptisia, and there's the sedum, and then there's all the weeds, because yes, I have lots of weeds like everybody else. My garden is not perfect whatsoever. Now, there are sedums that are going to bloom, like I have an early spring sedum that'll probably bloom like first part of May, mid-May. But the majority of our sedums are going to bloom like towards August and September. And they too, I don't know if you can see, there's a honeybee, there's a bumble honeybee. They're loaded with bees and bee species. Yeah, they just move in the summertime when they're being pollinated. Another one called neon. All different types of sedum, and I'm telling you, if you go to, I think it's Spring Meadow Nursery, Chris Hansen and his brother Hans, they are pumping out varieties of sedum that are just unbelievable colors. Oranges and maroons and just spectacular. That Dazzleberry Sunsparkler has purplish foliage with this color. Ground covers, taller ones, they're really doing a great job with sedums. This is our native sedum, Sedum tornatum. This is stonecrop sedum. You'll find this in native plant areas, Clifton Gorge. It looks like this without the flowers. It blooms in June. So sedums are an excellent addition to any landscape. And then my husband can't figure out why I pay money for goldenrod, right? I swear I just buy them and slip them in, and well, they've been there forever. You gotta do that, don't we? This is fireworks. Goldenrods are super for pollinators. This is a cultivar called Fireworks, and in our somewhat limited data we got from last year, this was very attractive to a lot of the pollinators. We have this one in our research plots. So it was very attractive to the pollinators. And then I have 5 of our native pollinators in my quarter-acre prairie. Fortunately, I live on 5 acres, so I can experiment and do all this stuff. But again, with the sizes of things that are getting smaller, you can too. Anybody with a small urban landscape can do this for pollinators. In this prairie, I've got several grasses, Silphium laciniatum, Silphium perfoliatum, prairie dot, lots of different pollinator plants. But right in this corner somewhere, I have 5 native species of pollinators. And I say somewhere because I haven't found them yet. They're hard to identify. I know they're there. I hope they're there because I paid good money for them. But I do have the stiff sunflower right there. So I'm trying to incorporate these native plants in that area, but don't forget, I'm also incorporating them into my big perennial border as well. All right, I'm going to get on the pest management or pesticide soapbox for right now. IPM, Integrated Pest Management. Anybody use this? Everybody should be using Integrated Pest Management. It started in the 60s. It's nothing new. It's looking and observing, identifying plant problems, selecting the right product if you're going to use a product, or saying, hey, there's one generation, it's not going to hurt my plants, I'm not going to do anything. So it's using intentional observation in terms of pest problems instead of just going out and spraying on a regular basis. Marshall, back when I used to work at Tom and Jerry's in Downing's Garden Center, Marshall Goodfellow lives 3 blocks over here. He was my mentor. I don't know if you remember, but there was a guy that used to come in every year and buy a case of quart isotox. Do you remember that? A case of isotox, which was like, cents off the market. But I finally asked him, because all I could see is this green glow coming from his landscape. and I said, why do you use a case? You know, what do you spray? He sprayed everything constantly, which meant he pretty much had a sterile landscape, which means he had to spray constantly because the good bugs weren't taking care of the bad bugs. I had a corporate park manager call me, and she had burning bush years ago when I first started. And I had just learned from our entomologist that if you didn't spray burning bush for 2 spotted spider mites and let them go, eventually the good mite population would jump up and you wouldn't have to do this. And she had been paying to have them sprayed every year, and she was paying quite a bit of money. And she asked me about this, and I said, well, I just learned this, give it a try. And it worked perfectly. Stop spraying, save that money. Didn't need to because the good mites were taking care of the bad ones. So IPM has to do with looking, observing, scouting. Keep plants healthy, right plant, right location. Insects, pests know when plants are not healthy. In the garden, use floating row covers. I'm getting ready to buy my broccoli, and I know I'm going to be fighting those white butterflies, you know, that you see right now. They're laying their eggs. Those are the cabbage worm butterflies. I know I'm going to be fighting them from now until I harvest my broccoli. I'm going to use row covers, put right on top of them, that will prevent the caterpillars from coming in. We did that one year at our old office as an experiment, and unfortunately, we put it on a little bit too late because we protected all of them that were inside there. And when we took it off, I mean, they were just riddled. It's like, okay, timing is important, right? Rotate crops. Don't let the insect populations build up in your vegetable garden. Rotate crops. Resistant varieties. Sanitation. Don't let weeds go to seed. Don't let them go to seed, because those weeds are where a lot of our insects that overwinter, they're going to hide in there. And if you're going to spray, choose the right product. I prefer, if I can, to use soaps or oils. Horticultural oils, not cooking oil. Insecticidal soaps, not dish soap. Dish soap can harm plants. So things that are softer in terms of the chemicals. These are not broad spectrum. They're not going to kill everything. They're only going to kill the certain insects like the aphids, the scales, the mealybugs, and so forth. So select the right product. Limit your pesticide use in the landscape. Follow the label. The label will tell you if you cannot spray it when the bees are pollinating. And pretty much every insecticide you cannot spray when bees are pollinating, or you should not spray when bees are pollinating. Make smart decisions. When are our pollinators out? When do they come out? Between 10 and 2, right? Don't spray between 10 and 2. Years ago, you might have heard about the guy in Oregon who killed the 500 million or however many thousand bees. You remember that one? Well, by doing that, he potentially prevented us from having a really good insecticide that is very safe to use. But it's not safe to use when you spray it in the middle of the day on linden trees when the bees are out pollinating. That's why 50,000 bees died, because he didn't follow the label instructions. He sprayed it while they were pollinating. Of course it's going to kill them. It's an insecticide. Insecticides kill bees. Do herbicides kill bees? Herbicides kill soft green tissue. The mode of action on herbicides will not affect insects, will not affect pollinators. Now, that doesn't mean you want to go out in the middle of the afternoon and spray it. You want to wait until early morning or late evening, but herbicides will not. You've heard of no mow May? I should ask the mayor and city council, will you let people go in the entire month of May without mowing their grass?
Probably not.
Oh, yeah, I might get a few phone calls on that, right? Not a good decision. But how about no spray May? Why are they pushing that? Don't spray the dandelions. Because dandelions are great for bees. Those yellow dandelions are perfect. After they're done, they go to bloom, or they go to seed. That's when you spray them anyways. So if you don't want dandelions in your landscape, I understand, but wait until after they finish blooming. You know, somebody mentioned lawns earlier being part of the landscape, the dominant part of the landscape. Lawns are here for a reason. Why were lawns created back in Victorian times and so forth? Erosion. Not erosion. Public health. Public health. Think about if everybody in Centerville had a native plant garden in the front of their house and the back of their house. What do those native prairies collect? Let me tell you, our barn cat from next door lives in my prairie. Why? He can find everything. He can find anything and everything. The moles, the voles, the mice, rodents. Lawns were created with a purpose, using that for public health. So you've got to balance that. Ticks. We were out yesterday with the grandkids, and after we came back in, we heavily inspected everybody for ticks. So public health, there's a reason why we have lawns, but we don't have to have all lawn and nothing else, right? So time of day, formulation, inert ingredients. You know that herbicides and fungicides are pesticides. Pest means to, or side means to kill a pest. The neighborhood kids that come around through your flower beds are pests. You don't want to kill them, of course, but side means to kill. So a pesticide is the broad umbrella. Herbicide means green tissue, insecticide means insects, molluscicide means mollusks, and so forth. Okay? Tolerate some damage. Remember I told you about the leafcutter bee? That's what this damage is. And it's just the coolest thing. This leafcutter bee, isn't nature amazing? She comes in, this is epimedium, she'll do it to hosta and a few other broadleaf plants that are out right now. And she'll take her mouth part and chew this perfect little semicircle. She chews that up, carries it all back to her hive, which is usually in the stem of perennials, old perennial stems, goes down in there, packs it in, and that is where she lays her eggs for her larva. She does this one time a year, and that's usually right now into the end of May. Do we worry about it? No, the new growth comes up, the new growth covers that up. We don't have to worry about that, right? Dandelions, as I mentioned. Now, I will say, when my husband and I were planting our landscape, 5 acres of cornfield, we're driving down in Old Blue, and I said, Rick, what color do you think the grass should be? Of course, he said green. What do you mean? It's always green. I said, well, I like it purple with violets, white with clover, and yellow with dandelions. Now, mind you, that was in 2012. Today, I have a different opinion because those dandelions, clover, and violets have gotten into my perennial beds. And let me tell you, if you have violets around the base of some of your perennials, oh my goodness, I mean, it's horrible to get them out. So the happy medium here is in the backyard. We can have all that stuff. In the front yard where my beds are, no, I want it nice and clean. And he likes that because he wants it nice and clean, but in the backyard we don't care because the kids play back there too. Invite your beneficial insects. You know, again, watch your sprays, what you use, but there's a lot of beneficial insects. Ladybird beetles, syrphid flies. Every one of you know what a syrphid fly is. I promise you, I guarantee you, I bet my life on it. Last few years, we've had high populations. And these things are the ones that come behind your knee where you're sweating and get here and get on your skin and they tickle, but they don't bite. Do you remember those? They'll be back this year. They don't bite. We all call them sweat bees. We all call them sweat bees, but they're not bees. They're flies. You know how we know? Flies have 2 wings, bees have 4 wings. They don't bite you. They just irritate the heck out of you. And we've had really high populations, which is good because their larva eats a little bit of everything. So next time you have them, and I keep telling my kids, don't swat them, don't kill them. They're good, but they are annoying. That's for darn sure. This is a spring pollinator-friendly landscape. Trees on the left. Oak, I highlight because oak is also one of those trees that we all should have for larvae. It supports the largest number of caterpillar larvae and moth larvae that you can find. So it is a great one to use for the landscape. All of these others on the right are shrubs and also perennials. I have a question mark by daffodils. Daffodils is one of those plants that have been bred so much. Look at your daffodils and see if you find pollen on them. And I went out yesterday and checked a few of mine. Very little to no pollen on the anthers. And you'll see it. You'll look in there to the cup. Our old species daffodils, many of the old ones that were the originals, they will have pollen, but the new ones that have been bred so many times, there's very little pollen on them. Summer pollinators, trees, shrubs. Hydrangeas are excellent pollinators. You'll see a lot of native bee species on our hydrangeas. And then your fall, if you don't know what heptacodium is, look it up, Seven Suns flower, or Seven Suns tree. It is a medium size, it could be a medium sized shrub, or if you want to prune it up into a smaller tree, you can. Blooms in August, September, and it has, I can't tell you how many species of pollinators it's on that plant. Does anybody have one when it blooms? Unbelievable. You walk by that thing and it's just making all kinds of noise. So it's a great small shrub or medium-sized tree. Sumac, we get less going into the fall in terms of pollinator plants, but try to look at what you can add to your landscape for that. Build a gourmet landscape. Spring, early summer, late summer, look at all the different things you can use and remember to choose 3 species in each of those seasons. So here are some resources. This one, Bee Lab, this has a plethora of resources on here. This is where you'll find plant lists, you'll find the bee ID guide where you can identify Ohio native bees. You'll find all kinds of great things on there in terms of honeybees if you want to raise honeybees and so forth. Great resource that you can use, and again, it's on the handout that you can download. I maintain, and will continue to maintain, it doesn't have to be all or nothing, and you all should just plant something. Thank you very much.